December 26th, 1900, Boxing Day. The relief ship Hesperus slices through the Atlantic's gray churn, bow pointed toward the Flannan Isles. Now, on deck, Joseph Moore watches the horizon. As the relief keeper, he's prepared for the standard maritime rhythm, a signal from the shore, a waving arm, perhaps a lantern flicker. Instead, the island of Eilean Mòr sits dead in the water. The lantern is dark, the flagstaff is bare. There's a weight to that silence, a stillness that feels physically heavy on a rock usually defined by the violent, perpetual collision of wind and stone. Here's the thing. In the rigid, uncompromising world of the 19th century lighthouse keeper, the light is the absolute law. It is the only thing standing between shipping lanes and the jagged basalt death waiting below. When Moore finally rows to the shore and scales the 80-foot cliff ascent, the dread solidifies. He finds the lighthouse door locked from the inside. When he forces the heavy iron latch, the air inside is stagnant, as if the tower itself hasn't breathed in days. The fire in the grate is cold, coated in a thick, gray shroud of ash. The clock, the heartbeat of the station, has stopped. It is the beginning of a riddle that refuses to age. The Flannan Isles, known as the Seven Hunters, are jagged teeth jutting out of the Atlantic. Before the lighthouse was built in 1899, sailors avoided them after dark, whispering that the basalt stacks were the tombs of giants. It is an island riddled with natural tunnels and chasms. When the wind strikes the geometry of these cliffs, the island generates a low-frequency hum, a subsonic drone that vibrates the human chest cavity. It is a natural psychoacoustic trigger, but these men were not victims of folklore. James Ducat was a veteran who had weathered decades of North Sea isolation. Thomas Marshall was steady, precise, a man who lived by the clock. Donald MacArthur, known as the Giant, was a formidable, volatile laborer. These were not men prone to flight or fancy. Life in a lighthouse was a marathon of invisible, grinding labor. It wasn't just watching the light, it was an endless cycle of maintenance. Every day required hauling heavy canisters of oil up narrow, spiraling stairs, a grueling, full-body strain. They had to polish the massive Fresnel lens, a glass honeycomb that magnified the light with extreme precision. A single speck of dust or a smear of salt spray could refract the beam, risking a ship's life. It was hypnotic, monastic work that stripped away all distraction. Yet inside that living space, the scene suggested a life interrupted mid-sentence. When Moore stepped through the door, the sensory input was jarring. The kitchen table was set for a meal that had gone cold, leaving a faint, greasy residue on the plates. A chair was overturned, skidded across the floorboards. Most chillingly, their heavy oilskins, the thick, rubberized coats essential for survival against the freezing Atlantic spray, were missing. All of them, except for one. One set of oilskins remained on the peg. One man had stepped out into the pitch-black December night, unprotected. This is where the physical reality fractures. Investigators found that the railings on the western landing were bent outward, as if something massive had struck them from the inside. The crane used to haul supplies, usually bolted tight, was twisted. But there were no bodies, no blood. And honestly, it's the specific human detail of the weeping that haunts me most. The entries for December 12th through the 15th describe a hellish, unprecedented storm. They record hurricane-force winds that shook the lighthouse to its foundations. They detail grown men, hardened by the sea, weeping in terror, a total visceral collapse of professional dignity. But here's the massive structural problem with these entries. Official maritime records for the Flannan Isles during those exact days show calm, mirror-like seas. The sky was clear. The wind was manageable. The storm in the logbook was a phantom. If those men were witnessing a violent gale that was not occurring, their own minds had become the epicenter of the disaster. This points to what some whispered about in the trade as lighthouse keeper's disease. In 1900, isolation was absolute. Without radio or reliable communication, the brain, starved of external stimulus, begins to cannibalize its own sensory input. It manufactures reality to fill the void. If you remove the storm as an external event, you're left with three men hallucinating a catastrophe so vivid that they felt compelled to document it. The entries end with the cryptic, haunting sentence, "God is over all." It reads less like an official log and more like a final, desperate resignation. We are left with two competing explanations. The rogue wave theory is scientifically plausible. The Atlantic shelf here is violent. The ocean floor drops from 100 meters to 3,000 meters in mere miles. This causes incoming swells to amplify, and when they hit the cliffs, they can reflect back, creating interference patterns where waves merge to rise as high as a 10-story building in seconds. Such a wave could explain the bent crane. But that is what nobody can explain. It fails to account for the interior. The lighthouse remained locked from the inside. The glass lantern room, sitting high above the landing, was untouched. A wave that could carry away three men while they were outside would have shattered that glass. If they were swept away by the sea, how did the lighthouse remain sealed? If they were inside, what could force them to abandon their coats in the freezing dark? We are left with a logbook that records a storm that never broke, and a tower that stayed locked while its occupants vanished. The coats remain on the pegs. The soup sits cold on the table. In the end, we are left with a logbook recording a storm that never happened and three men who ceased to exist. What if the most dangerous thing on that island wasn't the sea, but the silence itself? The Flannan Isles lighthouse isn't just some structure sitting on a rock. It is a sentinel, perched precariously on a basalt pillar 150 feet above the churning North Atlantic. To put that in perspective, that is the height of a 15-story office building. Now, if you want to understand the mystery of Eilean Mòr, you have to picture the geography. It's not a beach. It is a jagged, vertical scar in the earth, polished smooth by millennia of relentless swell. The western landing was designed with heavy iron railings and a massive supply crane, all of it bolted deep into the bedrock. This is our crime scene. And in the next 8 minutes, we are not just recounting a ghost story. We are using forensic physics to dismantle the most famous theory of this mystery and uncover what actually happened on that rock. The official narrative, the one that has lived in the history books for over a century, suggests a rogue wave, a wall of water reaching 150 feet, struck the landing with such violent force it warped 2-inch thick iron, destroyed the crane, and washed the three men into the abyss. It is a compelling, dramatic, and terrifying image. But when we strip away the folklore and look at the actual forensic physics, the math refuses to support that conclusion. We are not here for ghost stories. We are here to deconstruct a case where the physical evidence actively contradicts the narrative. Here's the first problem. A 100-foot wave is a known, documented phenomenon in the North Atlantic. But a 150-foot wave? That is a statistical anomaly that defies standard hydrodynamics. And here is where it gets interesting. If such a wave had actually struck the lighthouse with the force required to mangle iron, the energy dispersal would have been catastrophic. Think about the lighthouse lantern room. It sits at the very top of the tower, encased in glass. If a wave truly possessed the kinetic energy required to warp 2-inch thick iron railings at the base, the acoustic shockwave alone should have shattered that glass. Yet, the room remained untouched. This is the first crack in the foundation of the theory. The violence was far too precise. Some experts try to account for this by pointing to a mechanism called wave run-up, where energy compresses against a cliff face, forcing water to surge vertically. But to reach 150 feet, the pressure would reach upwards of 6,000 pounds per square foot. Such an impact would leave structural hairline fractures throughout the masonry joints of the tower. But the lighthouse remained sound. The damage was isolated entirely to the landing. So we have to look for something else. Think about the classic maritime locked room mystery. a lighthouse door latched from the inside, an uneaten meal abandoned on a table, a chair overturned in the silence. It is a tableau of sudden, violent interruption that has fueled a century of ghost stories. But here is the critical truth. None of that actually happened. There is no official record of an abandoned meal. The overturned chair? That is pure invention. That specific, chilling detail first appeared in a poem published in 1912, 12 years after the three keepers vanished. The entire legend of Eilean Mòr was built on a foundation of literary fiction, not forensic fact. Now, in this episode, we are not chasing ghosts. We are chasing the architecture of a lie. We want to see how a simple poem transformed a tragic disappearance into a supernatural myth. See, the real mystery isn't what happened on that island. The real mystery is why we have collectively decided to prefer the fabrication over the reality. On December 26, 1900, the relief ship Hesperus broke through the churning Atlantic to reach the Flannan Isles. Joseph Mòr, the relief keeper, stood on the deck scanning the cliffs. The weather had been brutal for weeks, and the station was overdue for a shift change. Mòr peered through the salt spray, looking for the usual signs of life, a signal, a light. Instead, he met a vacuum. The lighthouse lantern, the only reliable constant in that stretch of ocean, was dark. When Mòr rowed ashore and scaled the 80-foot ascent to the gallery, the scene inside the lighthouse was sterile. The air inside was stagnant and biting cold. The fire in the grate was dead, choked by thick gray ash. The station's clock, the rhythmic pulse of their daily routine, had ceased to tick. It was a scene of domestic normalcy, interrupted. The riddle of the Flannan Isles had begun, and it arrived not with a scream, but with an eerie, suffocating stillness. But when you dig into the archival records, the real, boring, yellowing paperwork filed by the Northern Lighthouse Board, the ghost story begins to evaporate. You will not find descriptions of weeping or panic. Instead, you find precise bureaucratic reports about logistics, supply rotations, and weather conditions. Superintendent Robert Muirhead, the man charged with investigating the disappearance, did not look for spirits. He looked for inventory. He cataloged the provisions with the meticulousness of a man counting paper clips in a warehouse. He noted that the oil for the lamps was perfectly rationed. He noted that the logbook entries stopped on December 15th, detailing a severe storm, but then resumed with mundane notations about routine maintenance that continued for days after the supposed incident. The lighthouse was not in disarray. The lamp was cleaned, the wicks were trimmed. These reports were written by men whose jobs were to ensure the safety of ships, not to write penny dreadfuls. It is startling how quickly a professional maritime incident can be scrubbed clean of facts and repainted with superstition. Here is where the tragedy pivots into a product. By the early 20th century, the curse of the lighthouse was an established literary archetype, and the public was primed to accept it. To understand why this story stuck, we have to look at the lineage of media sensationalism. Before the Flannan Isles were transformed into a supernatural riddle, the blueprint was already laid by the legend of the Mary Celeste. In 1872, that ship was found drifting in the Atlantic, abandoned and silent. It wasn't a paranormal event, it was a mundane maritime loss. But the press of that era realized that facts did not sell broadsheets. Speculation did. A story about a ship found perfectly intact with food on the table, a complete fabrication, became the template for every maritime mystery that followed. By the time the Flannan Isles keepers disappeared, the empty ghost ship trope was already a goldmine for journalists.